calls us to consider our position, to consider our mindset. And then he closes with this powerful hymn. He wants us to consider his example. Look at this. It says, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Friends, as I read these words, I feel like I just left the shallow end of the pool and we're in the deep end of the pool. We're reading about nothing short of the dual nature of our Savior, that he was both fully God and fully man. Now, many, and I refer to it that way as well, many scholars, New Testament scholars, believe that this is a hymn. And they believe verses 6 through 8 to be a hymn, in particular because of the rhythmic nature of it in the original Greek, and because of the poetic way that Paul writes these words. And if this is a hymn, it's a hymn of humility. It's a song that builds by descending. And I want you to see stanza number one. Stanza number one in this song of humility, this hymn of humility, is that God humbled himself. It's one thing for us to tell men to humble themselves, but did you see this? That Jesus is God, a very God, and yet he humbled himself. And how did he humble himself? By becoming a man. He humbled himself by becoming a man. But then stanza number two, as if stanza number one is not overwhelming enough to the mind and the soul, stanza number two is that he not only humbled himself and became a man, he became a servant. Think about that for just a moment. He could have just been a man and come as an earthly king, born in a palace, and that still would have been humility compared to the glories of heaven. There is no palace, there is no kingdom, there is no throne that can compare to what he had in heaven. That's why in John 17, he says, Father, return me to the glory that I shared with you before the foundations of the world, because earth's glory doesn't compare to heaven's glory. Does that make sense? So it's humility just for him to come, and even if he was the most popular man in the world, that would have been humble enough, but yet he goes even lower and becomes a servant. The Greek word for form is morphe, and it means to take on the characteristics, the full characteristics. So he was in the form of God. He had all the full characteristics of God, all the omnis, omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, all of that. And he comes and takes on the form of a servant, having all the characteristics of a servant. Mark 10:45, the Son of Man came to serve, not to be served. But if that wasn't enough to overwhelm the mind, stanza number 3 of this hymn of humility comes in, and it tells us that he became such an obedient servant that he was obedient even to the point of death. That he obeyed God to the point where he says, Lord, he says, Father, glorify yourself in me, even if it means my loss. It makes me think of my dear friend John Zelenick, who often used to say, God, glorify yourself in me, even at my expense. It was a prayer that I heard him pray often, and I don't know if I've gotten to the point where I fully matured to the place where I can pray it with the same sincerity of heart, but I pray that I get there. I pray that we get there together, that we can say, glorify yourself in us, even at our expense, oh God. This is what Jesus did. You see the descent, this hymn of humility. He goes from heaven to earth. He goes from taking on the form of God only to the form of man, fully God, fully man. And then he takes on the form of a servant. And then he dies, but the hymn does not stop there. The crescendo, if you will, stands at number 4. He dies the worst death possible, even death on a cross. The greatest humiliation.